What if the war never truly ended, and the ghosts of soldiers still walked the corridors of a long-abandoned bunker? Tonight, we uncover secrets buried in the shadows of history, where reality blurs, whispers echo, and the line between life and death disappears. Welcome to Battlefield Secrets, where the untold horrors of war come alive. The North Atlantic coast lay shrouded in a thick, unyielding fog, and the cliffs rose like silent sentinels over the churning gray waters below. In the distance, the long-abandoned bunker appeared through the mist, its concrete walls darkened by decades of salt, rain, and neglect. A small detachment of British military engineers and intelligence officers approached, boots crunching against gravel and stone, their uniforms stiff and damp. Every step seemed swallowed by the fog, leaving the impression that the world itself had narrowed to the bunker's looming silhouette. The structure had stood for over half a century, a relic of wartime paranoia and strategic foresight. Built during the Second World War, it had once been part of a network of fortifications along the North Atlantic, intended to guard against enemy incursions. Its steel-reinforced walls and hidden observation points had witnessed countless drills, maneuvers, and quiet tension. Now, it sat silent, decaying, a mausoleum of a conflict long concluded, yet never fully forgotten. The team paused at the rusted entrance, checking their equipment and consulting maps. The archival blueprints indicated hidden chambers, storage vaults for ammunition, and a command room overlooking the cliffs. Every surface was cold to the touch, the metal handles slick with condensation. The first officer pushed the heavy door open, the hinges groaning in protest. Inside, the air was dense, carrying the faint odor of damp concrete and decay. Shadows pooled in the corners, stretching unnaturally in the flickering light of portable lanterns. As the men moved deeper into the corridors, they noted the precision of the wartime construction: the thick walls, the ventilation shafts, the reinforced ceilings, but also the signs of age. Cracked concrete, rusted bolts, and the remnants of sandbags caved in from neglect. The silence was oppressive. Every sound: their boots on the stone floor, the occasional drip of water from overhead echoed and seemed to linger, as if the bunker absorbed noise only to return it warped and delayed. Maps and records left behind decades earlier were scattered in certain alcoves, partially preserved in sealed cases, partially decayed into illegibility. The team photographed documents, noting insignias, sketches of patrol routes, and inventory logs for ammunition and supplies. These materials told a quiet story of preparation and fear, a narrative of soldiers' lives reduced to lists of equipment and drills. Yet, amid the archival detachment, there was a subtle unease. Small movements in the corner of the eye, a flicker of shadow, a whisper of shifting air suggested that the bunker's history was not entirely inert. One officer paused, sensing a presence in the darkness beyond the lantern's reach. The beam swung over empty corridors, walls, and steel doors, but nothing appeared to move. Another stepped forward, brushing against a cold surface, only for the shadow at the edge of his vision to shift again. There was no wind, no source for the subtle creaks and groans, yet the sensation of being observed persisted. The bunker seemed to breathe, exhale, and watch simultaneously, as though the very walls remembered the footsteps of those long gone. They continued surveying, careful not to disturb fragile structures, yet every action carried a mounting psychological weight. The isolation, the fog pressing against the exterior windows, and the oppressive silence inside conspired to warp their perception. Each metallic echo of movement was amplified into suspicion, each flicker of light into a lurking threat. The old fortification was more than stone and steel. It was a repository of memories and perhaps of something else, something that had outlasted its creators. As the first lanterns flickered, casting elongated shapes along the cold walls, one young officer whispered to his companion, and both froze. Across the corridor, a shadow moved, yet no one had walked ahead. They exchanged glances, tense and uncertain, the familiar rules of reality bending under the weight of the unseen. The bunker had not yet revealed its full story, but already it had begun to assert itself, a quiet force pressing on the minds of the living. The first footsteps echoed, the senior officer noted in his log later, but no one had moved. The inspection team advanced cautiously into the second corridor of the bunker, lanterns cutting through the dense shadows that pooled along the cold concrete walls. Dust motes floated in the shafts of light, dancing silently as if to the rhythm of some unseen presence. The first room they entered seemed frozen in time. Tables collapsed under the weight of decades, crates toppled, and scattered personal effects littered the floor. Here, the bunker's human history was tangible: letters yellowed with age, photographs curling at the edges, a broken helmet resting atop a rusted ammunition box. The soldiers and officers bent to examine the items, documenting and photographing every scrap of material evidence. A leather-bound diary caught the attention of one officer. Its pages were brittle but legible, filled with the cramped handwriting of a soldier detailing nightly patrols, fears of betrayal, and whispered suspicions about comrades. Each entry painted a portrait of a mind stretched thin by isolation, discipline, and the omnipresent threat of enemy attack. The archival value was immense, yet an uncomfortable tension grew as the team read through the intimate accounts. It was one thing to study history on paper, quite another to touch remnants of lives lived in constant fear. Letters tied with frayed ribbons told similar tales. Some were addressed to mothers and fiancés, pleading for understanding and expressing hope that the war would end soon. Others were coded notes between officers, hinting at mistrust within the ranks, suspicion of spies, and unspoken dread. Photographs captured groups of soldiers smiling beneath the sun, their joy fragile and fleeting against the stark, cold backdrop of the bunker's interior. Uniform insignias, meticulously preserved, revealed the units stationed here: Royal Navy reconnaissance, coastal artillery brigades, and engineering detachments tasked with maintaining the fortification. As the team cataloged the artifacts, subtle anomalies began to unsettle them. A helmet that had rested on a crate moments earlier now lay slightly askew. Letters tied in a neat bundle seemed looser than before. The youngest officer blinked, certain he had not moved anything, yet the arrangement of objects had altered. Whispered questions passed between members of the team. Had one of them disturbed the items unknowingly? Or was the bunker itself asserting a strange control over its contents? The shadows seemed to thicken with each step, and every creak of the old structure sounded unnaturally deliberate. One soldier picked up a diary, its spine cracked, and flipped it open. A photograph slipped from between the pages, landing face up on the cold floor. He swore it had been face down. Across the room, another officer noticed a pair of gloves on a table had shifted position, their fingers pointing toward the doorway, as if directing attention. Eyes darted nervously, hands hesitated over notes and cameras. Rationality strained against instinct. The evidence of movement defied explanation, and an invisible weight pressed on their minds. They continued through the room, documenting carefully, yet every movement felt amplified in the oppressive silence. The bunker seemed to respond to their presence, each shadow lengthening, each corner darkening as if alive. The diary spoke of fear long past, yet in some spectral way, the dread remained, permeating the air and insinuating itself into the team's consciousness. The sense of being watched grew unbearable, not by a human observer, but by the lingering memory of those who had walked these halls decades earlier. Finally, the senior officer stepped back to survey the room. Items that had been meticulously cataloged were no longer in their original positions. The lanterns flickered as if struggling against some unseen interference. A cold draft swept through the corridor, carrying the faint, metallic scent of old gunpowder and dust. Every rational explanation failed under the weight of the inexplicable. The room had not been entered, he muttered, voice low, and yet the objects were not where they belonged. The inspection team withdrew briefly to the small command office at the bunker's heart, a space scarcely larger than a closet, yet lined with racks of yellowed files, brittle maps, and fading ledgers. Fog pressed against the small, reinforced windows, blurring the distant cliffs of the North Atlantic. The team's historian, a thin man with spectacles fogging in the damp air, began cross-referencing names from wartime logs with the artifacts cataloged in the bunker. It was then that a chilling pattern emerged. Among the lists of officers and crew assigned to the coastal fortification during the early 1940s, one name repeatedly drew attention: Lieutenant Edward Harrow. According to naval dispatches, he had been posted to the bunker during its final operational months, but the records abruptly ended. No casualty report, no burial records. His fate remained entirely undocumented. Whispers among the team suggested the possibility of a clerical oversight, but the historian shook his head. Not possible, he muttered. Every other man is accounted for. Only he disappears. The team returned to the bunker's interior to compare notes with physical evidence. In a narrow corridor, rusted hooks along the wall bore faint imprints, scratches almost imperceptible but distinct to a trained eye. They traced the marks to a pattern remarkably similar to the insignia of Lieutenant Harrow's uniform, a single chevron above a brass star, worn on his naval sleeve. The scratches were uneven, jagged, as though clawed into the stone over time, yet there was no other logical explanation for their presence. The walls themselves seemed to whisper of the vanished officer, a silent testimony etched decades earlier. The soldiers and officers moved cautiously along the corridor, their footsteps echoing against the damp concrete. A single lantern cast long shadows, elongating the scratches into grotesque, impossible shapes that danced across the floor. One of the younger researchers swore he felt a cold pressure brush his shoulder, but no one was there. The sensation traveled down the spine of each team member, an unspoken acknowledgement that the bunker's history was not confined to paper and stone. It lingered, active, almost sentient. In the adjacent storage room, more artifacts hinted at Lieutenant Harrow's presence. A pair of boots, polished to a dim shine, sat atop a crate. Their size and insignia confirmed the ownership. Diaries once belonging to other officers contained fleeting mentions. Harrow disappeared into the northern wing. No trace. The walls watching. Each entry, brief and fragmented, carried a tone of panic restrained by formality, yet the fear was palpable across the decades. The bunker seemed to collect it, storing it like the thick layers of dust on the floor. The historian traced the line of scratches further, leading to a corner where the stone floor had been scuffed repeatedly. Here, he noticed faint impressions of a body lying prone, long since vanished but still suggested by the marks. The thought that a man had been claimed by the structure itself sent a shiver through the team. Every creak of the old ceiling felt like a breath, every distant drip of water a heartbeat in the darkness. The distinction between past and present blurred. As the lanterns flickered in unison, the senior officer stepped forward, eyes narrowing. "We are not alone in here," he said quietly. The words barely left his lips before a heavy door slammed somewhere deeper within the bunker, reverberating through the halls. No wind, no draft, just the echo of a presence long vanished but unwilling to remain forgotten. The team froze, the shadows around them thickening, and the historian's voice trembled as he whispered, was he a ghost, or had the bunker claimed him forever? The corridors of the bunker stretched endlessly, wet concrete walls absorbing every footstep and amplifying the smallest sounds. The inspection team had barely settled after their discovery of Lieutenant Harrow's markings when the first signs of auditory disturbances appeared. At first, it was subtle, a creak of a door that no one had touched, a soft scuff against the floor that seemed out of rhythm with their measured steps. Sergeant Mitchell paused mid-stride, ears straining. "Did anyone else hear that?" he whispered. A chorus of nods answered, though the team's eyes darted uneasily toward every shadowed corner. The bunker seemed to breathe with them, each exhalation a groan through steel-reinforced doors. The fog that had seeped in from broken windows now clung to the walls like a cold, gray veil, muffling yet intensifying the unnatural echoes. It started as footsteps light, measured, deliberate. They did not match the pace of any team member. Captain Ellis stopped and raised a hand. The sound shifted, passing through the far corridor, circling back as if the structure itself were following them. They advanced cautiously, every lantern casting trembling, elongated shadows on the cracked concrete. Then came the murmurs. Indistinct, overlapping, they whispered through the halls in languages unfamiliar to the crew. German, French, perhaps Russian, fragments of conversations that seemed to recount decisions, fears, and commands from another age. The historian squinted at a stack of ledgers leaning against the wall, but the voices did not align with the records. "They are not coming from the rooms," he murmured. "They are in the walls themselves." A door slammed somewhere deep in the bunker. No wind moved, no hands touched it. A wave of unease swept the team. The officers exchanged tight glances, their faces pale in the dim light. Even the most rational among them could not explain the repetition of creaks, whispers, and shuffling that followed them through every hallway. The concrete corridors, once a symbol of durability and wartime strength, now seemed like the skin of a living organism, pulsing with memory. Then came the radio. A small, portable set that the team had brought to monitor airwaves began to crackle on its own. At first, there was only static, but then a coded message emerged, patterns of Morse code the officers recognized from wartime communications manuals. The words were fragments, disjointed, as if replaying intercepted transmissions from decades past. Lieutenant Rowe, who had studied cryptography, froze. This isn't possible. No one is operating this device. Yet the message continued, cryptic and precise, as though the bunker itself were transmitting secrets from a bygone war. The team moved deeper into the structure, trying to rationalize the phenomena. Could wind and temperature fluctuations explain the whispers? Perhaps faulty wiring triggered the radio? But every theory collapsed under observation. The sounds had cadence, intent, and timing far beyond random chance. The historian held a diary he had found earlier. The murmurs now seemed to echo its contents: commands, reports, even personal grievances of soldiers long dead. Sweat ran down faces. Hands trembled on lanterns. The corridor narrowed, shadows thickening as the voices grew louder, more insistent. One by one, the team felt a chilling realization. The bunker was alive with echoes that were not merely historical, they were active, aware, observing. Every step they took, every whisper they tried to ignore, seemed to invite the unseen presence closer. And then, as a particularly clear footstep echoed behind them, though no one was there, the senior officer froze, lantern raised high. From the depths of the walls came a murmur, crisp and deliberate, in a language none of them could place. It spoke of decisions, betrayals, and fear, carried decades forward in stone and steel. The team stood in tense silence, the shadows around them quivering. Captain Ellis whispered, almost to himself, someone or something was speaking from inside the walls. The fog inside the bunker thickened with every step. Lanterns swung gently from hands, casting long, wavering shadows across wet stone floors. Hours or perhaps days had passed since the team first entered, though no one could be certain. The relentless gray mist clung to walls and ceilings, curling around corners and muffling sound, making every footstep seem distant, yet too close. Sleep-deprived eyes strained in the half-light. Lieutenant Rowe swore he saw a figure dart past a hallway, just for a heartbeat before vanishing into the mist. Sergeant Mitchell turned sharply, lantern raised, but the corridor was empty. "It's just the fog," he muttered, though his voice lacked conviction. No one responded. Everyone had begun to feel the same creeping unease, the slow erosion of certainty. As hours dragged on, hallucinations became common. Shadows stretched into forms that seemed human. Whispers of voices indistinct but urgent filled the ears of the crew. The historian's hands trembled as he examined a rusted locker, convinced it had moved since the last glance. It wasn't like this before," he stammered. The officer beside him merely nodded, pale and silent, understanding without words. Isolation had begun its work. The crew felt the walls pressing inward, stone corridors stretching impossibly, time losing all meaning. One member, Corporal Hayes, vanished without a sound. The last anyone saw of him was a blur in the mist down a narrow passage. Panic rippled through the group as they called his name, their voices swallowed by the fog. Hours later, he staggered back into the main chamber, soaked and shivering, eyes wide and unseeing. "I don't know where I went," he whispered, voice trembling. Tom had slipped away. No one argued. The bunker had claimed him, if only for a while, and the unspoken truth weighed heavily on everyone. The team now understood that the structure was not merely haunted by the past, it was feeding on the present. Every shadow seemed to move independently, every whisper carried intent. Even the lantern light appeared hesitant, flickering against unseen forms that followed, observed, and waited. Suspicion grew among the team members. Glances that once conveyed camaraderie now carried doubt. Could anyone be trusted? Lieutenant Rowe caught Sergeant Mitchell staring too long at another officer's back, and for a moment, wondered if he saw what the others did or if paranoia was simply consuming them all. The fog of the mind was denser than any mist outside, and it carried a sharp, gnawing fear that whispered of betrayal and unseen eyes. Footsteps echoed where none should exist. Laughter, or perhaps a cry, resonated from corridors that led nowhere. The bunker had learned to manipulate perception, making familiar hallways alien and familiar faces threatening. Each creak, each whisper, each shadow tested the boundaries between reality and imagination. The men and women of the team began to drift, thinking they saw former soldiers who had died decades earlier, glimpses of movement that were not, fleeting figures just beyond lantern light. By the time they reached the central hall, exhaustion had transformed their minds into fragile instruments of fear. Every heartbeat was audible, every breath too loud. The walls seemed to lean in, as if to listen, as if to judge. And then, from a darkened doorway, a figure stepped forward, a glimpse, a flicker, nothing substantial. Yet the eyes, cold and knowing, seemed to pierce straight through the soul. Captain Ellis swallowed, lantern trembling in his grasp. "The bunker has taken one," he whispered, voice barely audible. He paused, swallowing the fear curling through his chest. "And now it watches the rest." The bunker's corridors grew colder with each step, the fog clinging stubbornly to stone walls. Lanterns swung lightly in the hands of the inspection team, casting fractured light across wet floors. At first, the shadows seemed ordinary long, trembling reflections of the crew, but soon, subtle movements caught the eye. Lieutenant Rowe noticed a figure on the far wall, crouching behind a beam, though no one had been there a moment before. "Did anyone else see that?" he whispered, heart tight. No one answered immediately. Their eyes darted to the walls where dark silhouettes seemed to shift with intent. The shadows moved against the light, independent of any human form. One moment, a shadow crouched low as if digging a trench. The next, it rose, mimicking the stiff, precise drills of soldiers Rowe had only seen in black and white photographs from archives. The movement was too accurate, too disciplined to be coincidence. Sergeant Mitchell muttered under his breath, "That's impossible, none of us have been in the trenches." Yet the walls displayed otherwise. Across the damp concrete, entire platoons appeared in silhouette, marching, ducking, and loading rifles. The eerie reenactments were meticulous, soldiers taking cover, firing, signaling, advancing. Shadows even mirrored the iconic movements from training manuals, their execution flawless though no one alive had witnessed them firsthand. The historian in the team moved closer, shaking his head. "These matched drills from 1942 German, not British," he said, pointing at the wall. "How could anyone or anything remember this?" The fog inside the corridors thickened, weaving around the figures, sometimes partially obscuring them, sometimes revealing details with terrifying clarity. Shadows of officers gestured as if giving commands. Men in silhouette fell and rose again, trapped in an eternal exercise of war. The crew's reflections in the wet stone floors distorted their own forms, merging with the phantoms on the walls. Each man felt their pulse quicken, mind struggling to discern reality from illusion. Lieutenant Rowe felt a chill as he observed one particular shadow, a corporal falling in a trench, then disappearing as if erased from existence. Yet another took its place in the sequence, identical in movement, identical in detail. There was no pause, no explanation, no origin. The entire hallway became a stage, the past unfolding without living actors, replaying battles long ended. "What is this?" whispered Private Hall, voice quivering. "We didn't fight here, no one alive has." The answer remained elusive. Each shadow moved with purpose, yet they were hollow. They left no footprints, made no noise, yet their actions carried the weight of authenticity. The team began to feel watched, as though unseen eyes observed their reactions to the spectral reenactments. Every corner held the possibility of another formation, another maneuver, another phantom lost to time. Time itself felt distorted. Moments stretched into eternities, as if the bunker had become both audience and stage, trapping the living within the memory of the dead. The fog swirled thicker, and the walls seemed to pulse with the rhythm of the reenacted war. Lieutenant Rowe's lantern swung wildly, illuminating a final, haunting tableau, a squad of shadows advancing, rifles raised, charging a position no one had seen. But when he blinked, the figures vanished, leaving only the empty hallway. The historian exhaled shakily. "The ward's playing again, but the soldiers are missing," he whispered. No one disagreed. The crew knew, in the marrow of their bones, that reality had become secondary to memory, that the shadows were the remnants of men long dead, and that somewhere within the walls, the past had taken hold. The table was cluttered with dust-laden papers, brittle with age, their corners curled and ink faded to a muted sepia. Lantern light flickered across the room, casting shadows that danced over the scattered letters and diaries. The inspection team had moved deeper into the bunker, and in a neglected alcove, they discovered a small chest of wartime correspondence, carefully preserved but abandoned as if someone had fled in haste. Sergeant Mitchell lifted the first envelope, trembling fingers brushing against the wax seal, still faintly intact. The handwriting was precise, flowing in loops that belonged to another era. He opened it slowly. The words were mundane at first, reports of daily routines, rations, patrol schedules, but then they shifted. Mentions of sabotage, clandestine movements, coded messages intended for officers in other parts of the coast. The letters referenced men who, according to historical records, had disappeared decades ago inside this very bunker. Lieutenant Rowe leaned closer, squinting at the faded ink. "These letters talk about a trap set in the northern corridor," he said, voice low. "That's where the shadows are most active." The historian's eyes widened. "It can't be these letters were written in 1944. That section of the bunker hasn't been disturbed in decades." As they read further, the words became unsettlingly precise. One letter described a sudden, inexplicable chill that would sweep through the hallway. Another warned of a flickering light that would reveal figures no living soul could see. When the team looked up, the fog in the corridor shimmered, and the lanterns wavered as if confirming the writer's predictions. Private Hall picked up a diary, its leather cover cracked and stiff. Opening it, he gasped. The entries detailed encounters with fleeting figures, phantom footsteps echoing in the night, whispers that seemed to come from the walls themselves. The crew exchanged nervous glances. Each description matched exactly what they had experienced in the preceding days. Lieutenant Rowe traced a line in one page. "Here the writer says a man will disappear, then return claiming lost hours. That's exactly what happened to Jenkins last night." Silence fell, broken only by the occasional drip of water from the bunker ceiling. The weight of realization pressed down on them. The letters were not just relics, they were warnings, records of events repeating through time, somehow entwined with their own presence. The crew felt their breaths shorten, hearts thudding in rhythm with the words on the page. "Is someone orchestrating this from the past?" Sergeant Mitchell muttered, voice barely audible. "Or has the bunker itself learned to speak?" The historian shook his head. "These are WWII intelligence notes, coded for safe transmission during the war. They reference movements, sabotage attempts, enemy spies, but the timing lines up perfectly with what we're experiencing now. It's impossible." Yet, impossible or not, the crew could not deny the evidence before them. Every prediction, every subtle warning, mirrored the present. The letters were a bridge, a connection between decades, carrying messages from soldiers long dead to those still breathing. The walls of the bunker seemed to pulse with acknowledgement, responding silently to the realization that time itself was no longer linear here. Private Hall's hands shook as he set the diary down. The words, "They knew we'd come. They knew what we'd see. They knew." Lieutenant Rowe's eyes scanned the table once more, the flickering shadows emphasizing the eerie weight of the room. The letters were more than artifacts. They were harbingers, guiding the living through the echoes of the dead. And as they all looked toward the northern corridor, where the shadows had moved independently, a chilling thought settled in every mind. The past was not past. The historian whispered, voice quivering. The words had crossed decades to speak directly to us." No one argued. Each man felt the intangible pull of the letters, the spectral reach of history pressing in through paper, ink, and memory. The bunker's silence now carried meaning, and the past had a voice, one they could no longer ignore. The fog in the bunker clung to the walls like a living thing, curling around pipes and dripping from rusted beams. The crew moved cautiously, boots scraping against wet concrete floors, lanterns casting thin pools of light that barely penetrated the dense, gray mist. Tension had been mounting since the discovery of the wartime letters. Every shadow, every whisper seemed amplified in the suffocating corridors. Private Jenkins had been unusually quiet that morning, trailing behind the group. Sergeant Mitchell called his name several times, but only the echo of the bunker replied. When they reached the northern wing, the lanterns flickered violently, and a cold draft swept through the hallway. Jenkins' voice answered soft, trembling, but it was not coming from where he stood. Jenkins' Lieutenant Rowe whispered, scanning the fog. The voice repeated, closer this time, calling his own name in perfect imitation. The hairs on his neck pricked. The corridor was empty. Panic rippled through the team. They spread out, searching every nook, every shadowed corner. The fog seemed to thicken, swallowing their shouts, distorting the echo of their footsteps. Cameras set up along the hallways recorded only static and intermittent flickers of light. Nothing showed movement. Nothing showed Jenkins. Sergeant Mitchell pounded on doors, shouting into dark rooms, but no response came. Hallways looped back on themselves. Or so it seemed. The layout of the bunker felt intentionally deceptive, a labyrinth designed to disorient. The crew's radios crackled intermittently, but their own voices emerged distorted, layered over the sound of something unidentifiable moving through the fog. The historian's hand trembled as he rifled through maps, trying to orient himself. He noted a strange pattern. The missing crew members in archival World War II records had all vanished from the northern wing, the same area Jenkins had disappeared. Reports described soldiers entering a corridor and never returning, just as Jenkins had now. Then came the sound, soft at first, almost imperceptible. Footsteps echoed, slow and deliberate, following them down the hallway. They paused, the echoes paused. Each man felt eyes on his back, though the fog revealed nothing. And then, a faint whisper, Jenkins' own voice, "Follow me." Lieutenant Rowe's heart pounded as he realized the impossibility. Jenkins could not be ahead, behind, or beside them. He was gone. Yet his voice was inside their ears, inside their minds, pulling them forward. The team tried to retreat, but the corridor seemed to stretch endlessly, walls closing in, corners bending unnaturally. Private Hall, clutching a lantern, swore he saw a shadow dart behind a support beam. He shouted, but his words were swallowed by the fog. For a brief moment, it felt as though the entire bunker was alive, watching them, reshaping itself around their fear. Minutes or hours passed. When the fog began to thin slightly, the spot where Jenkins had last been was empty. No sign of struggle, no footprints leading away, no sound but the soft drip of water. Every creak of the structure seemed amplified, each echo a potential harbinger of disappearance. The historian swallowed hard. This matches documented accounts from the war, he said, voice shaking. Soldiers entered these hallways and never returned. Cameras, searches, patrols, nothing. Just gone. A chill ran down their spines as they realized Jenkins' voice had stopped. Complete silence enveloped them. And then, just as they began to speak, a faint, mocking imitation of each man's own voice emerged from the dark, calling, coaxing, inviting. The corridor seemed to breathe, alive with the echoes of the vanished. Sergeant Mitchell gripped his rifle tighter. The team clustered together, each aware that the next disappearance could be theirs. They could not see, they could not hear the culprit if there even was one, but the fear was palpable, oppressive, and inescapable. Lieutenant Rowe whispered, barely audible over the ringing in his ears. Someone or something was leading them into the darkness. And for the first time, they understood the gravity of their isolation. The bunker was no longer merely a structure. It was a predator, and Jenkins had become its first offering. The fog clung thicker than ever, seeping through cracks and ventilation shafts as if the bunker itself exhaled. Each breath the crew took seemed swallowed by the cold, metallic corridors. Lieutenant Rowe's flashlight illuminated the walls, revealing condensation streaming along rusted beams, yet the temperature gauge on his wrist dropped steadily, inexplicably. 5 degrees in 10 minutes, murmured the historian, jotting down the readings. Instruments flickered and clicked, compasses spinning erratically, Geiger counters indicating phantom spikes, and cameras failing as if their lenses refused to record. Every attempt to document the anomalies ended in static or blank screens. A metallic clang echoed from a corridor ahead. Private Hall rushed to check the door, but it refused to budge. Even the keys and manual overrides failed. "It's locked," he said, voice tense. "No mechanical reason, it just won't open." Sergeant Mitchell tried another route, but the same phenomenon repeated. Doors shut just before their touch, hinges groaning under pressure, latches clicking without force applied. Every path they attempted seemed anticipated, corrected, manipulated. The bunker's architecture felt mutable, walls subtly angling inward, corridors shortening or elongating, passages folding over themselves. Rose's breath frosted in the lantern light. "It's like it knows where we're going," he said, his tone clinical but strained. The others nodded in tense silence. The fog thickened, swirling unnaturally, as if pushed by unseen hands. Each step became a negotiation with the building, every movement mirrored and countered by the cold stone around them. The team attempted to set up a series of scientific tests, thermometers along the walls, cameras on tripods, barometers to measure pressure fluctuations. Yet readings fluctuated wildly, instruments shorting as though the metal itself resented observation. Even the old electrical wiring, long abandoned and corroded, flickered as if alive, buzzing with malicious intent. Private Hall shivered. The ventilation, it's breathing. The sound was subtle at first, a faint rush of air, but it soon became a rhythmic inhale and exhale. The fog pulsed along with it, curling into the corners, spreading like a living thing. The team realized that the bunker wasn't just an empty structure. It responded to them, to their fear, to their attempts at control. A sudden shudder ran along the floorboards. The walls themselves seemed to pulse, expanding outward for a heartbeat, then contracting, imperceptibly but deliberately. Each corridor appeared to twist subtly in real time, just enough to unbalance perception. The crew's maps and sketches became useless. Distances no longer matched their measured steps. Lieutenant Rowe's voice was barely audible above the metallic echoes. "We're not inside a building. We're inside something else. Something aware." The team exchanged glances, the clinical detachment they had clung to slipping under the weight of dread. From the northern corridor came a low, resonant creak. It sounded like timber bending underweight, but no support beams were under pressure. The temperature dropped sharply, a biting cold that stole the warmth from their bones. Every exhalation produced mist that clung to their cheeks. Each breath an effort against the unseen atmosphere the bunker seemed to exhale upon them. Sergeant Mitchell tried to rally the men. "Document everything. Don't panic. We've handled anomalies before." But even his voice betrayed fear. The walls shifted imperceptibly, subtly narrowing the hallway as if testing them. The crew felt trapped in a living entity, encased in stone and fog, their instruments useless, their senses betraying them. Rowe's lantern trembled in his hand as he whispered, almost to himself, "It's alive, it's watching, it's moving." And then, with a barely noticeable shift, the walls contracted further, imperceptibly but undeniably. The corridors felt impossibly narrow, the ceiling impossibly low. Panic coiled in their chests, and every rational explanation failed. The bunker had become a predator, breathing, anticipating, controlling. "The walls, they're closing in," Rowe muttered, the archival, investigative tone of his observations eroding under the weight of terror. Every attempt at rationality dissolved into the oppressive, sentient fog. The crew realized, with a cold certainty, that survival here was no longer a matter of skill or preparation. It was a matter of enduring the will of a living, breathing structure that responded to their fear. The bunker was aware, and it was patient. The walls shifted imperceptibly, closing in on them. The narrow corridor ended abruptly, revealing a hidden passage behind a rusted iron panel. Lieutenant Rowe ran his gloved fingers along the hinges, the metallic groan echoing down the fog-filled bunker. The team's lanterns illuminated the entrance, revealing dust motes drifting in the dim, stale air. The corridor was narrower than the rest, walls lined with shelves groaning under the weight of decaying ledgers and metal filing cabinets. "Archives," whispered the historian, voice taut with both awe and dread. "No one's touched these since the war." The air smelled of mildew and rust, the cold seeping into their bones as they stepped forward. Each footstep sent small puffs of dust into the lantern light. The shelves were filled with brittle files, handwritten notes, photographs yellowed with age, and schematics of bunkers, trenches, and weaponry. As the crew began sifting through the records, the oppressive silence of the bunker deepened, and the shadows in the corners seemed to pulse in rhythm with their breathing. Lieutenant Rowe opened a ledger and found reports of intelligence operations, detailing sabotage missions in occupied territories. Names, dates, locations, the meticulous accounts of lives manipulated and broken. Some entries recounted psychological experiments on captured soldiers, sleep deprivation, forced isolation, exposure to fear. The descriptions were clinical yet horrifying, the kind of bureaucracy that turns cruelty into data. Private Hall shivered, flipping through photographs of soldiers and officers, some familiar from earlier discoveries in the bunker posed in drills, their faces serious, unknowingly caught in the machinery of war. But as he turned the pages, the figures in the photographs seemed to shift under his gaze, their eyes moving subtly, almost imperceptibly. Sergeant Mitchell held up a file, the paper brittle in his hands. These missions, they weren't just sabotage, they were experiments. Psychological manipulation, coercion, fear as a weapon. His voice faltered. Suddenly, a faint whisper echoed along the corridor. The crew froze. It was soft at first, unintelligible murmurs in a language they couldn't recognize. Then it grew louder, interspersed with rustling papers and the faint clang of a door swinging somewhere in the distance. The team looked around, but the shelves stood unmoving, the ledgers undisturbed. Yet the sound persisted, insistent, intimate. It became clear that the bunker was no longer merely a repository of history. The archives themselves seemed to replay the horrors contained within. Voices of past officers, cries of soldiers subjected to fear and coercion, whispers of betrayal and desperation all echoed in the walls. Every file opened, every photograph examined, seemed to animate the shadows around them, replaying memories not their own. Lieutenant Rowe tried to maintain a clinical tone as he documented the discoveries, but his hand shook. "The past isn't dormant," he murmured. "It's alive here," it responds. Private Hall gasped, dropping a ledger. On the cover, a faded stamp marked "Top Secret." As it hit the floor, a whispering chorus seemed to swirl around him, voices overlapping, recounting events from the documents in real time. His own heartbeat thundered in his ears, yet the room remained motionless, save for the flickering lanterns and the shifting shadows. The crew realized with dawning horror that the bunker did not merely store history, it enforced it. Observing the archives became participation. Reading the files, handling the ledgers, the team felt themselves drawn into the unfolding terror, their senses manipulated as if the bunker were a living entity, replaying its wartime obsessions on the living. Sergeant Mitchell backed toward the exit, his voice breaking. "We need to leave. It's too much. The past, it's reaching for us." Rowe looked around, lanterns revealing the endless shelves stretching into darkness, the whispers intensifying. He swallowed hard, pen poised above his notebook. The clinical observer was gone, replaced by a participant in the bunker's performance. And then, as the last echoes of footsteps faded, a chill swept the corridor. The air felt dense, almost sentient. Every shadow deepened, every whisper sharpened. The past had awakened, and it was demanding attention. The past had awakened and was demanding attention. The bunker seemed smaller than before, corridors narrowing as fog thickened into an almost tangible presence. Every breath of the crew mingled with the damp air, forming fleeting clouds that vanished before the lantern light. Lieutenant Rowe walked ahead, but even he felt the weight pressing on his mind. Whispers from the archives still lingered in his ears, and now, a new tension pulsed among the team. Private Hall stopped mid-step, eyes darting to the shadows along the wall. "Did you see that?" he whispered. It looked like Sergeant Mitchell, standing behind the corner, but it wasn't him. Sergeant Mitchell spun around, lantern raised high, scanning the fog. "I'm right here," he said, voice taut. But Hall's gaze stayed fixed, and a chill spread through him. The shadow had moved independently, mimicking Mitchell's gestures with an eerie delay, a perfect double. The team gathered in the main corridor, trying to rationalize what they had seen. Rowe's notebook felt heavier in his hands. Words seemed insufficient for the mounting dread. One by one, each crew member began to report sightings, shadows walking in tandem, mirrors reflecting faces that didn't belong, faint footsteps following them even when they were alone. Arguments erupted. Paranoia festered like a disease. Private Hall accused Mitchell of tampering with their instruments. "You're trying to manipulate the logs," he shouted, eyes wide with fear. Mitchell's hands shook, gloves gripping the lantern tightly. "I would never. You're losing your mind. I saw you talking." To his words died as the fog shifted, revealing a shadowed double of Hall staring back. Lieutenant Rowe tried to restore order, but even his commands felt hollow against the oppressive silence and shifting shadows. Each man became uncertain of his own senses. Were the whispers real, or was the bunker mimicking the voices of long-dead soldiers? Each flicker of movement became suspect, each sigh and footstep a potential betrayal. The fog thickened in the corners, curling around walls and beams, and the shadows seemed to take form. They didn't simply follow, they anticipated gestures, mirrored expressions, and at times, moved independently of their owners. Crew members recoiled from the doubles, as if encountering enemies in the flesh. Their lanterns illuminated the fog, but even then, the outlines refused to conform to reality. Sweat ran down Rowe's forehead as he tried to maintain a clinical approach. He noted the psychological effects of isolation and stress, sensory deprivation, heightened fear response, and the mind's capacity to create doubles under extreme duress. The fog, shadows, and ambient echoes amplified every misstep, every glance into a corner threatening betrayal. Private Hall backed into a wall, pointing at a shadow that mimicked his every motion. "It's me, but it's not me," he screamed, voice breaking. Sergeant Mitchell's lantern flickered, casting fragmented light that fractured reality further. Each man began seeing doubles of himself and one another, a terrifying multiplication of presence that made trust impossible. And then came the realization: the bunker was weaponizing their fear. Every shadow, every whisper, every distorted reflection fed the team's paranoia. Arguments turned into accusations, and each member began to retreat into isolation, fearing that their comrades were no longer fully themselves. Rowe's pen trembled as he wrote in his notebook, documenting not just the shadows, but the fractures in human trust. The bunker's psychological assault was complete. Fear had become its instrument, and the crew was the instrument's victim. A sudden clang echoed through the corridor, and the lantern light revealed a double of Rowe himself, standing across the hall, immobile but unmistakably him. His stomach churned. Who was real, and who had been taken? The question hung in the air, heavier than the fog, and the bunker seemed to lean closer, as if eager to answer. The morning light that filtered through the bunker's narrow vents revealed new horrors. Scratches had appeared along the cold, concrete walls overnight, as if etched by unseen hands. Letters, hastily scrawled in pencil on torn scraps of paper, littered the damp floors. Each message was different, uniquely tailored, and disturbingly precise. Lieutenant Rowe picked up one note, trembling as his eyes scanned the words: "You always feared failure. You left men behind in the North Atlantic. They remember." He froze, the paper crumpling in his grasp. None of the crew had spoken aloud these memories, yet here they were, in the bunker's silent shadows. Private Hall found an inscription scratched into the wall beside his bunk: "Cowardice hides in your gait." Cuthbert remembers. Hall's stomach churned. The reference to his own prosthetic leg, a personal secret he had confided to no one, made the hair on his arms stand on end. The bunker did not merely observe, they knew. Sergeant Mitchell ran his gloved hand along another wall, feeling the rough grooves of letters freshly carved. "Trust dissolves when shadows linger. You cannot hide." The message was addressed to him personally, referencing a time he had hesitated during a past training exercise. The fear that these walls held a sentience beyond comprehension gnawed at the edges of his mind. Each member of the team found similar notes. Some were cryptic, filled with coded references to their personal lives. Others were more direct, recounting thoughts and fears never shared aloud. There was no uniformity to the handwriting, some elegant and precise, others jagged and hurried, yet all impossibly accurate. The crew attempted to rationalize, scanning the bunker for pranksters or mechanisms that could explain the messages. None were found. Cameras recorded nothing, and the fog that clung to the hallways seemed to absorb light, rendering surveillance useless. Every inch of concrete was silent, yet the walls seemed to pulse with knowledge. Rowe recalled reading about graffiti practices during wartime, coded messages left by resistance cells and intelligence agents, but nothing explained the specificity. These inscriptions did not merely communicate. They probed, personalized, and threatened. The bunker's concrete skin had become a mirror of their own psyches. As the crew gathered in the central chamber, a sense of paranoia suffused the air. Each man and woman glanced at the other, hesitant to speak, for fear that their thoughts might appear on the walls next. Whispered confessions felt dangerous. Even silence was no refuge. The bunker seemed to absorb memory itself, twisting it into tangible warnings. Private Hall shivered as he noticed a long series of scratches along a corridor wall. They spelled his deepest fear, abandonment. Rowe noticed a short, urgent note addressed to him personally: "You cannot protect them. History watches, and you will answer." The psychological weight was unbearable. The team's collective fear hung thick in the air, almost visible, twisting shadows around them. And then, as night fell again, a new message appeared spanning multiple walls, intertwining with previous scratches. It was in multiple hands, overlapping, impossible to decipher fully, yet every crew member understood it intimately, as if their own subconscious had been projected onto the stone. By dawn, the bunker had spoken clearly. Every secret, every fear, every hidden shame had been recorded in the cold gray walls. The crew realized that they were no longer visitors. They were exposed, transparent to an intelligence they could neither see nor escape. Lieutenant Rowe swallowed hard, voice barely a whisper. The walls knew them better than they knew themselves. The bunker's corridors seemed to contract as the crew followed a narrow passage that none had explored before. Their flashlights pierced the fog, revealing peeling paint and rusted metal bolts, the smell of damp concrete hanging thick in the air. Somewhere deep within, an unusual draft hinted at a hidden space. Lieutenant Rowe signaled for the team to stop. Every instinct screamed that the source of the phenomena lay ahead. After careful inspection, Sergeant Mitchell discovered a panel in the wall, nearly camouflaged by decades of grime and dust. With a groan, the team pried it open, revealing a small sealed chamber. The air that escaped was cold and stale, carrying the scent of time itself. Inside, neatly arranged on wooden shelves, were personal effects boots, a tattered uniform, letters, and a diary. These belonged to the vanished soldier whose story had haunted the bunker for decades. Private Hall approached cautiously, running gloved fingers over a diary bound in cracked leather. The handwriting inside was meticulous, yet filled with fear and despair. Each entry recounted mundane camp life, drills, and minor grievances, but then the tone darkened. Mentions of whispers in the corridors, strange shadows, and the feeling of being watched mirrored the crew's own experiences. As the team examined the artifacts, an old phonograph, surprisingly intact, began to crackle to life. The voice that emerged was faint, then clearer, a recorded message from the vanished soldier himself. The words chilled the crew to their core. "They will come. They will follow the paths we carved into this stone. Beware the shadows. They remember all who walk here." The team froze. How could a recording made decades ago anticipate their presence? Every word was unervingly precise, as if the bunker itself had orchestrated this moment. Dust motes swirled in the faint light, moving almost like living entities around the chamber, and the echoes of the message lingered long after the phonograph had stopped. Lieutenant Rowe scanned the shelves. Letters sealed in envelopes, still intact after decades, carried addresses that no longer existed. Photographs of soldiers, crisp even in black and white, stared back with unblinking eyes. It was as if the chamber had preserved not just objects, but the very essence of memory and fear. Each artifact seemed imbued with an unseen presence, and the air vibrated with anticipation as if the bunker itself awaited the crew's next move. The crew's instruments flickered erratically, temperatures dropped sharply, and shadows lengthened unnaturally. Sergeant Mitchell whispered, "It's like the walls themselves are alive, listening, recording, guiding." No one dared dispute him. The boundary between life and death, past and present, seemed to dissolve, leaving only an oppressive awareness that their every thought was transparent to the bunker's unseen consciousness. Rowe turned to the team, voice low and steady despite the gnawing terror. "This isn't just history, it's a warning. Every artifact here, every word written, every sound recorded, it has been waiting for us." He swallowed hard, glancing at the phonograph. The bunker had not only preserved the past, it had anticipated the present. As they backed out of the chamber, the shadows in the corners of the room seemed to stretch toward them. The whispers of decades past mingled with the crew's own breaths, and the realization sank in with a crushing weight. They were never merely visitors. The bunker had already claimed them in memory before they had stepped through its doors. Lieutenant Rowe paused at the threshold, eyes fixed on the sealed chamber one last time. The walls seemed to pulse, alive with decades of fear and expectation. In a voice barely above a whisper, he muttered, the past had orchestrated their fate long before they entered. The crew's panic had become a tangible force as they surged through the narrow corridors of the bunker. Flashlights cut swaths of light through the oppressive darkness, illuminating rusted pipes, peeling paint, and the cold, unyielding concrete walls. Every turn seemed familiar yet different, as though the bunker itself had shifted while their backs were turned. Lieutenant Rowe led the group, consulting the schematic maps, but every corridor appeared to contradict the diagrams. Hallways branched where they should have ended. Doors led back to rooms already explored. Private Hall's breath came in sharp bursts, fogging the cold air, and he stumbled over a loose metal plate that had not been there moments before. Sergeant Mitchell tried to mark their path with chalk, but within minutes the marks had vanished as if they had never existed. The atmosphere grew heavier, laden with a sense of impending doom. Sounds bounced unpredictably, footsteps echoing when no one was moving, whispers ricocheting from unseen angles. Every corridor seemed to stretch further than physically possible. The team called for the exits, their voices swallowed by the thick, blackened shadows. Panic began to infect the rational mind. Small disagreements escalated into shouting matches as fear fractured cohesion. They found a door at the end of a hallway, its hinges strangely smooth for a structure this old. Relief surged in escape, perhaps, but as they approached, the door vanished. In its place was a solid wall, concrete, unbroken, and cold. Lieutenant Rowe slammed his fist against it, leaving a red mark that immediately seemed to fade into the gray. "We're trapped," he whispered, more to himself than to the others. The crew tried another passage, this one descending into darkness. It narrowed inexplicably, forcing them to squeeze past one another. The air was damp and smelled of mildew and decay. Moisture dripped from overhead pipes, hissing as it struck the floor. The concrete walls seemed to pulse subtly, as if breathing. Lieutenant Rowe's rational mind noted the possibility of structural anomalies, yet every rational explanation collided with an unshakable, suffocating sense of manipulation. Psychological strain became apparent. Hallucinations flickered at the edges of vision, shapes darting just beyond the flashlight beams, shadows mimicking movements before the crew made them. Private Hall screamed as he thought someone or something touched his shoulder, only to find the corridor empty. Sergeant Mitchell's compass spun erratically, instruments malfunctioning without apparent reason. The bunker itself had become an active participant, orchestrating their fear with precision. Hours or perhaps minutes. Time had lost meaning past as the crew pressed on. Every attempted exit dissolved into another dead end. The walls seemed to watch, closing imperceptibly, while the fog inside thickened, clinging to clothing and skin. A low, metallic groan echoed through the passageways, synchronized with the pounding of hearts. The team's panic became self-perpetuating. Fear guided their movements, and every attempt to flee only led them deeper. Lieutenant Rowe tried to rally his team, calling out coordinates and directions, but the bunker responded with confusion. Exits appeared for a fleeting second, only to vanish again when approached. The corridors seemed alive, anticipating each movement, each thought, each moment of weakness. Finally, Rowe stopped, gasping, shoulders slumped, and looked at his team. Their faces reflected exhaustion and terror, wide eyes fixed on unseen horrors. The fog swirled thicker, and the echoes of their footsteps returned distorted, mocking, omnipresent. He whispered, barely audible. The more we ran, the deeper we sank into the bunker's grip. No one responded. No one could. The bunker had claimed not just their path, but their perception, their reason, and perhaps even their souls. The fog had begun to lift over the North Atlantic cliffs, revealing the bunker's silhouette against the gray dawn. Outside, the sea roared as if mocking the horrors within. Only a handful of the inspection team had emerged, their bodies exhausted, minds frayed, and voices hushed. They moved in silence, eyes darting toward the bunker as though expecting it to strike again. Lieutenant Rowe walked slowly, each step echoing hollowly on the wet stones. Behind him, Sergeant Mitchell and Private Hall lingered, silent, carrying the weight of experiences that could not be shared. Their uniforms were streaked with grime, their hands trembling from exhaustion and fear. The air outside felt almost unreal, too bright, too solid, compared to the shifting walls and shadows they had left behind. The bunker had been officially declared abandoned, a relic of wartime paranoia and rapid engineering. Yet to the survivors, it remained alive in memory. Every creak of a door, every gust of wind through the cliffs, seemed to whisper the corridor's secrets. The letters, shadows, and whispers had left impressions that no amount of daylight could erase. Their notebooks, intended to document structural findings, were filled instead with frantic sketches of impossible corridors and annotations about sounds, movements, and faces that should not have existed. They said it was empty, Rowe murmured, flipping through his notes. But it was never empty. Private Hall glanced toward the bunker's entrance, the cold sea breeze blowing his hair across his pale face. "Do you think it was them? Or us? Our minds?" he asked. His voice trembled, betraying the lingering doubt. Sergeant Mitchell shook his head slowly. "I don't know. Maybe it was both. Fear magnified into something tangible, something that could move, speak, watch." His eyes, hollowed by sleepless nights, lingered on the heavy metal doors now sealed for good. Even hours later, the survivors could not shake the feeling of being observed. Cameras recorded nothing unusual. Instruments showed no anomalies. And yet, the psychological imprint of the bunker remained. The walls had not simply contained the past, they had reflected it, manipulated it, and left a trace that clung to the living. Historical surveys would later classify the site as structurally safe, noting only minor maintenance issues. Reports praised the inspectors' diligence, but mentioned nothing of the phenomena that had claimed the mental stability of most of the team. Few would believe the sketches of shadows mimicking long-dead soldiers, the diaries predicting events decades later, or the voices whispering secrets known only to those inside. The survivors carried the weight of what they had seen, the knowledge that horror could arise from a combination of human paranoia and echoes of tragedy. Some would leave the military, unable to reconcile their experiences with normal life. Others would continue service, but haunted by the understanding that certain places retained memories far beyond human comprehension. Lieutenant Rowe lingered near the bunker's entrance one final time, watching the fog curl against the stone walls. The air smelled of salt and decay, a reminder of both the war that had shaped the structure and the psychological battle it had waged. Somewhere deep within, behind the sealed doors and concrete walls, remnants of the past seemed to linger quietly, watching, waiting, aware. As the team finally turned to descend the cliffs, Rowe cast a final glance backward. The bunker appeared inert, lifeless, a mere monument to history. But in the corner of his vision, a shadow moved where none should have been, and a shiver ran down his spine. The sea continued its ceaseless roar. The cliffs remained jagged and cold, and the bunker, though officially empty, held its secrets tight. The bunker may be empty, but the eyes remain. The soldiers are gone, yet their stories of fear, betrayal, and the shadows that linger remain etched in history. What you've witnessed tonight is only one of countless untold secrets of war. If you were intrigued by this story, hit like and subscribe to Battlefield Secrets for more chilling tales from the front lines. Share your thoughts in the comments. What would you do if the shadows of war were watching you?